Spies and Spymasters Happy Hour, brought to you by the International Spy Museum. My name is Shauna Oltmans. I'm the Exhibitions and Programs Manager at the museum. I'm going to be co-hosting today with my colleague, Hannah Saloyo, and we're going to be joined today with our drink demo by Bombs Away Brewery. There's John, he's ready to go. And then the focus for tonight is really all about balloon spies. And so we have our historian, Vince Houghton, who's going to be joined by our very special guest, Jim Green, who is the chief scientist of NASA. So what an exciting week for us to have a guest from NASA, right? And now on to Hannah, who has some crucial intel on tonight's beverage supplier.
Thanks, Shauna. So when we were thinking about this program and we came up with Balloon Spies, Sean and I, both our minds immediately went to Albuquerque, New Mexico for a couple of reasons. If you know anything about balloons, right, or at least hot air balloons, you know that Albuquerque, New Mexico is the home of the world's largest hot air ballooning convention. And bonus points, we're both from Albuquerque, New Mexico. So we wanted to partner with an at-home brewery, which led us to Bombs Away. John, I see you over there dressed up for me tonight in your bomb suit. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came up with your cool brewery name?
Well, first, let me take care of this real quick. Yep. I always want to cut the red wire. Hey everybody, I'm John from Bombs Away Beer Company. A little about me. I was a explosive ordnance disposal tech in the Air Force for 14 years.
Wow.
So basically that is, we disarm bombs. That took me to Iraq and Afghanistan a couple times, and that's where the inspiration for Bombs Away came from. So before we get to the beer, I do want to thank the Spy Museum for the invitation to this. We really appreciate that, and we hope everybody's got a beer to taste along with us. So without further ado, we'll get to the beers. So first up, we have our Proximity Pilsner. We brew this as a classic German Pilsner inspired beer. We do make it in Albuquerque, and we don't comply with all the purity laws, but we make this a dry, crisp, hop forward Pilsner.
Ooh.
Yep, that's a pretty good one. The name Proximity in Proximity Pilsner is a little bit of a throwback to Albuquerque. So Albuquerque and Sandia National Labs developed the proximity fuse for ordnance under the code name of VT for variable time. So a little bit of espionage was going on there to try to find out what we were developing. So they named it something else to throw off the adversary. All right, our next beer we have today is actually a hybrid. It's a cider and a beer. So this is our all clear apple beer. And what we do here is we take apple juice from a local farm here in Albuquerque. Actually, they're in Corral, and they juice the apples for us. We harvest wild yeast in their orchard, let that ferment the entire batch of beer. We add malted barley to comply with the legality of making it beer and not cider, but it is gluten removed, so we can have a cider with our brewer's license. So it's pretty much everything you'd expect. It tastes very much like a cider. I didn't tell you it was beer, you wouldn't know. So it's I think that's a unique one we make. I don't know of anyone else here in Albuquerque making something. And the name, All Clear, is it's an explosive term. So when a site would either be rendered safe, or let's say a technician was to check out any potential hazards, when that is all clear, then it's safe for others. There's no hazards remaining, or any hazards are safe. Our third beer that we're talking about today is Bombs Away I.P.A. So this is our hazy New England inspired IPA. We kind of go down the citrus and tropical flavor spectrum, along with some good bitterness, and we keep the alcohol a little reserved on it for an IPA. It's about 6.5, and I don't know where Bombs Away comes from.
Never guess.
Well, thank you, John. I want to say extra thanks for sending Sean and I a little taste from home. They sent us glasses, which is kind of hard to see, but they're awesome. They say like emergency drinking water on the back, which is wonderful. So for everyone watching, when we all can travel for fun again, hopefully you can go to Albuquerque. Tonight will inspire you to love all things balloons, and you can visit the Balloon Museum and go hit Bombs Away Brewery and have your own IPA. So thanks again, John.
Well, cheers,
I'll see you next time I'm home, I guess, whenever that is. Bye, guys. Cheers. And with that, we are going to turn it over to Vince. Vince, Jim, have a great program. We will see you when it's questions time.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Shauna. Welcome, everyone. I am joined by a great friend of the museum, Dr. Jim Green, who, as Hannah mentioned and Shauna mentioned, is NASA's chief scientist. Jim spent a career at NASA after he graduated with his PhD. I won't date you by saying what year it was, like a couple of years ago when you were 25.
Yeah, at least.
And before he was chief scientist, he had a just as cool job, I guess. He was the director of planetary science division at NASA, which meant that he was head of the division that launched the New Horizons spacecraft flyby of Pluto, the Messenger spacecraft to Mercury, the Juno spacecraft to Jupiter, the Grail spacecraft to the Moon, the Dawn spacecraft to Vestes and Ceres. And for me, the coolest thing is launching an SUV-sized nuclear-powered rover with a laser blaster on it, the Curiosity rover to Mars, just to name a few. So he's had a really fun job at NASA, and now he's the chief scientist. So we're here to talk about balloon reconnaissance. We're going to do that. But it's really stupid for us to do that without asking Jim first to tell us a little bit about some of the cool things that are happening right now at NASA, because I truly think as a space nerd, we're getting back to kind of a glory period of space exploration. And so you can tell us a little bit about what's going on now.
Vince, my great pleasure to be here and to do just that. But first, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank John for his service. And I'm absolutely delighted he's drinking his bombs rather than diffusing them. So wonderful to have John as your sponsor. And congratulations, John, for your service to this country. What's happening at NASA? Wow, all kinds of stuff. I mean, for the first time in almost a decade, we're launching our own 2 astronauts from the U.S. soil, from Kennedy Space Center. Now, we tried that yesterday, but the weather wasn't cooperating with us. The window was really too short to sit there and wait for the weather to pass us by. So now we have to wait until all the orbits get ready and the station gets back into position where we can take another shot at it. And that will be tomorrow at 3:22 East Coast time, okay? And so if you show up at 3:30, it's all over. We will have either launched or not, because the window, once again, is really short. So actually, we call it an instantaneous window. When that time comes, you punch the button or you don't go. So the next launch after that is indeed another nuclear-powered SUV-sized rover named Perseverance, and it's going to Mars. We're launching that on July 17th. That's when its window opens, and that's about a 3-week window. So we'll have plenty of time to get it off. It's nearly completely ready to go. It's all together, of course, and it's going through its final testing and checkout before they'll complete the assembly and assemble the rocket and stick it on top. So July 17th also out of the Cape. And then another spectacular thing's going to happen in a few months is we're already orbiting an enormous asteroid. This thing is called Bennu, named just recently by the OSIRIS-REx team, working with the public in their submission of names. And Bennu is a fabulous asteroid. It's a carbonaceous chondrite. We believe it is chock full of water, amino acids, and all the stuff that the Earth may have needed to start life, to start that spark, all right? And so it's left over from the early formation of the solar system. And so consequently, we'll get that sample in several months, and then bring it back and begin to analyze it in the laboratories. And then we'll see the life connection. And we'll really understand how the early solar system was put together and how life may have started here on Earth. So just a few of the spectacular stuff. And of course, from a Earth observing perspective, the high ground is always where you want to be. That's the place where you get the most information. NASA is really quite involved with Earth science satellites. We have about 25 Earth science satellites up and operating, and have a fabulous program in that area.
Now, Jim, you mentioned an asteroid. Did I read it right that a couple of years ago you had an asteroid named after you?
I did. Yeah, it's out in the asteroid belt. It's just a little bitty thing, but it's really quite an honor. I was honored by the community who they do asteroid hunting all the time. This was a new one they found, and that gives them the opportunity to name it. And I was very honored that they chose James Green as the name of the asteroid. Thank you.
Even if it's small, it's bigger than any asteroid I have named after me. So congratulations to that.
Well, we're not going to go to it anytime soon. It'll be a while.
So, all right. So let's talk balloon reconnaissance. And this is it's an interesting segue, right? We're going from 21st century space exploration to 19th century, and even in some cases, 18th century. Balloon flight.
Yeah, flight.
And this goes back to when we're talking about Henry Cavendish discovering hydrogen in the 1760s, and that kind of opened the window to all of this. What in the world made a future chief scientist of NASA interested in Civil War balloon reconnaissance? How did you get here?
Okay. It wasn't really a torturous path, but when I was 12, I wasn't thinking about being a scientist. I was just having fun as a kid. My grandmother gave me a picture book about the Civil War and said her father, that means my great-grandfather, was in the Civil War. And I loved the picture book. It was the American Heritage picture book by Bruce Catton. And I loved everything about the Civil War. And so the more I read, I've that 2 bookcases, or I guess there's 3 bookcases behind me, are all Civil War books. And then the ones over here are all science books. But what I found as I read an enormous amount about the Civil War as a general interest, a few things about balloons. A couple things came up, and I'm going, balloons? Really? In the Civil War? And it turns out the more I looked, the more I read, the more I realized it's a fascinating chapter of the Civil War. The ability to take the high ground, the opportunity to go up and view and obtain military intelligence. So military intelligence basically has, in this era, 3 basic parts. Okay, those 3 basic parts are, where is the enemy? Okay, that's where the high ground is important. Second part, how large a force do they have? And the third part, where are they going? And of course, during the Civil War, when you really split the country, many of the Northern Union officers and men had never been in the South. And so as they're moving into Virginia and other places, they're not getting their Google map. They're not figuring out, where these roads are. They're going to have to come up with a way to understand where the roads are and where they're going, because that's what the Army does. It travels along the roads. Rarely does it go off-roading, okay? And so consequently, once again, the balloon observations were really critical in making the early maps. And so at the beginning of the Civil War, the newspapers all over the place were talking about, the Union Army needs balloons. It's just a no-brainer, right? And indeed, Washington, D.C. was in a very precarious position. You had Virginia to the west, Baltimore, which and most of actually Maryland, and certainly the eastern shore of Maryland, very pro-Southern, and so it's nearly surrounded by the Confederacy, all right, or Confederate sympathies. And so consequently, you could read any of the Washington, D.C. newspapers of the time at the very beginning of the war, where the threat was, well, the Army could just come across the Potomac and knock off Washington, D.C. And so Lincoln, who also was quite enamored with a variety of technologies, really got interested in balloons early on. That was kind of natural. And so aeronauts from all over the place, particularly the northern aeronauts, would come into Washington, D.C., and they want to be able to become the chief aeronaut, okay? And the one that finally made it is Thaddeus Lowe. He becomes the head aeronaut of what's called the Aeronautics Department. It's also called the Balloon Corps, okay? And they were all contractors. Now, what Lowe did once he became, once that position became official, McClellan was the head of the Army, and McClellan also really liked this idea of getting intelligence from balloons. So he pretty much gave Lowe a blank check to do whatever he wanted to in terms of outfitting the aerodynamics or the Balloon Corps, or the Aeronautics Department. So if I can show you my first slide, this is what Lowe went about doing. Lowe had brought in his original balloon and used it, but he developed new balloons. Now, these are the famous Lowe balloons, the Union and the Intrepid, and many people have seen actually Brady photographs of the Intrepid, the Constitution, the United States, the Washington, the Excelsior, and indeed the Eagle. All right. Now those 7 balloons took up anywhere from 5 men. That'll be the larger ones, Union, Intrepid. 4 men, Constitution in the United States. 2 men, Washington, and 1 man, the Excelsior and the Eagle. So he had them in different sizes because depending on how fast you wanted to inflate them, you could inflate something and get it up. You'd use the Eagle or the Excelsior. So if you just sit back and look at these balloons, they're beautiful. I mean, the Albuquerque, yes, has the most beautiful balloons, of course. But when you think about it, here Lowe, who had perfected the ability to coat these balloons with an airtight shellac, and then paint them, and then annotate them, and they're all Union themes. They're all the themes of Washington, Constitution, United States. And it's really all about being in your face. He wanted everyone to know that a balloon was up and observing. Now, these were tethered balloons. They're specially designed to withstand the weather, withstand high winds, not extremely high winds, but reasonably high winds, because they are held to the ground, and they can last for long periods of time, because Lowe also invented gas generators or used illumination gas from the local gas companies in Washington, D.C. and in Alexandria also was used.
Let me interrupt you really quickly, because you mentioned that, and I want to bring, so we have listeners and people tuning in from around the world and around the country, but a lot of locals and certainly a lot of people who have visited Washington, D.C. And a couple nights ago, I had to get out of the house, so I went and I walked the mall, the National Mall, not this. Yeah. And just, I'm sitting there looking at the Air and Space Museum, at the Native American Museum, and I'm like, this is it. This is where it happened. So can you talk a little bit about that as a landmark? I mean, the perfect place to put the National Air and Space Museum is where that first demonstration for Abraham Lincoln took place.
Yeah, it really was. In fact, there's a plaque there that we dedicated to Lowe and Lowe's initial flight on the mall. Now, Joseph Henry, who was the secretary for the Smithsonian, he is in the castle, which is a very famous red brick building, looks like a castle. that's directly west of the Air and Space Museum. That's where the Smithsonian Institution was put together. And Henry was a big proponent of the balloons and knew Lowe and a number of the aeronauts, but he really convinced Lowe that Lowe needed to do a big demonstration if he had any hope of being the chief aeronaut. And so what Lowe did was he brought one of these balloons down to Washington, D.C., the Enterprise, obtained a number of military men, paid them actually to hold their ropes that was the tethers for the balloons, went to the local telegraph company and convinced the manager to give him a telegraph operator and a telegraph and with a long wire, and that setup was launched from where the Air and Space Museum is. The Enterprise went up about 500 feet with a telegraph operator in it, and the manager had to go anyway. And Lowe looked over with his glasses, his binoculars into Virginia, and then had the telegraph operator send Abraham Lincoln a message. Now that's a very famous message, and that particular message basically stated that from his point of observation, he could see an area 50 miles around, and he was really excited to tell Lincoln that this would be a successful opportunity to take that high road. Lincoln invited him over, and that night they stayed up late at the White House talking about how balloons could be used. Also, Lowe had that balloon filled at the gas company of Washington, D.C., which was sitting on the grounds of where the American Indian Museum is today. That's where the local gas company was. Now, they make carbonated hydrogen, so they burn peat, and what comes out of that is carbonated hydrogen, and they store that in tank, and then pump that through the city. And then when you walked in your house, you didn't turn on the electricity; you actually turned on a spigot, got this gas, and lit it. Okay, that was your light. It was illumination gas, but that was much lighter than air. And so this airtight varnish that Lowe had perfected allowed him to inflate any of these balloons and keep them airtight for up to 3 to 4 weeks sometimes. Now, this is phenomenal.
Right.
You can imagine, a hot air balloon, yeah, that's fun and it's great, and but it's only up for a limited period of time, hours at best. But with these kind of balloons, once they're filled, you could stay up for hours, 8 hours, 10 hours or more. And indeed, what Lowe had done was develop these gas generators, as you can see in this image. These are two major gas generators that you used iron filings, a dilute solution of sulfuric acid, and it's a what we call an exothermic reaction, and it generates hydrogen. You pop the hydrogen off the water as the oxygen really oxidizes the iron, and then that hydrogen gas can be cooled and stuck into a balloon. Now here Lowe is doing it in the field at the Gaines Farm. Now this is a fabulous part of the Gaines battlefield on McClellan's big push from Fortress Monroe all the way up to try to knock off Richmond, which he was unsuccessful at. But indeed, he brought Lowe, and Lowe brought all these balloons and all these men and all these hardware and equipment to be able to do this. Now, how did Lowe actually cart this stuff around? Well, not only did he have carts, wagons that brought material to the front, but in the next slide, what he did was he actually developed the first aircraft carrier. Okay, now this aircraft carrier is called the George Washington Parke Custis. Okay, now the George Washington Parke Custis is actually the name of this vessel. This vessel actually existed prior to the Civil War. It was owned by the Custis family, who lived in Arlington, okay? And it was used to take crops back and forth and people across the Potomac. And so when the early war began and the Union Army crossed over in Virginia and they confiscated stuff, they confiscated this vehicle, this vessel rather, sorry, and took it to the Navy Yard, and they were going to use it as a coal barge. And how they were going to do it is just take off the superstructure, fill it with coal, and then tow it out to the big freighters that couldn't come all the way up to D.C. because the Potomac wasn't deep enough, and so you had to take the coal out to these frigates. And so Lowe convinced once again McClellan that he really needed the ability to transport his balloons wherever McClellan wanted, and he needed this vehicle, which was the ship, which is an aircraft carrier. This is really our first aircraft carrier, and he used it all over the Potomac, up and down the Potomac. Now, at the beginning of the war, as I mentioned, the threat was the Confederates would cross the Potomac and into Maryland and really knock off Washington, D.C. And so Lowe, working with McClellan, had a series of balloons that he indeed brought all up and down the Potomac. He went up to what's called Edwards Ferry, which is way north. It's across from Edwards Ferry is Leesburg, okay? And then right across the Potomac River, he was at a place called Pohick Church, which is actually a little south of Alexandria. And then also Fairfax Courthouse. And then the furthest down the Potomac initially that he set up was at Bud's Ferry. And Bud's Ferry was where Hooker was. Hooker had a large force there. And the Confederates, which then across the river were in Virginia, also massed a whole series of forts and gun emplacements and blockaded the Potomac. We think initially that, the Anaconda Plan, which was General Scott's idea of just blockading the South by not allowing anything to come in from Europe into the Confederacy. The Confederates actually did it first by blockading the Potomac. So the next slide is Lowe had the Balloon Washington. He took it down with the G.W. Parke Custis down the Potomac and set it up right there at Bud's Ferry. And it was used constantly to look over into Virginia. It was doing those three things we talked about. How big is the Army? Where are they at? Where are they going? And so this particular sketch was done by a colonel of a Pennsylvania regiment. His name is William Small. And he loved to sketch, and he went up in this balloon, which was tethered. Lowe loved to tether his balloons and made these observations. Now, this is a particularly spectacular example of really getting a sense of what's going on from the high ground, because he delineates not only where the gun emplacements are, like at Cockpit Point and Shipping's Point, in many of these other areas, and then the boats that are in the Quantico Creek area, but also where the tents are, where the Confederates are holding up, and where they're, you can count the tents and get an idea of the number, You could also go up at night, look at campfires and count the number of campfires. And that gives you an idea as to the number of people, number of Confederates, and also where they're stationed.
So Jim, let me ask you this. There were pictures had been taken of cities like Boston and Paris from balloons prior to the Civil War, to that time period. Why no pictures from the balloons? Why you think we bring Matthew Brady up there and do what we do today and take a overhead reconnaissance photograph of the battlefield versus having somebody up there for hours drawing one of these sketches?
So a lot of newspaper reporters really pushed that idea. The new technologies were indeed the balloon, the telegraph. Lowe used both of those really effectively by taking telegraphs up in balloons. Why not a photographer, right? Lowe didn't like that idea. He kept poo-pooing it. Now, when you think about it, one of the reasons why is he wanted to be constantly employed. He wanted the balloons to be constantly observed. And he didn't really embrace that idea. However, let me mention one really important thing. I do believe photographs were taken from Lowe's balloons, and it occurred on the peninsula when Lowe got malaria and had to go back to Philadelphia. And so he turned over the management of his balloons to James Allen, another spectacular aeronaut. Now, James Allen, it was Allen and Black who actually went up in Boston Commons just a year before the Civil War started and took the very first pictures of Boston, first pictures from an aerial platform in the United States, period. Okay. So he knew how to do this. And so Lowe left and he was in control, and he had it for about a month, well, actually almost a month and a half, July 1862 and into August 1862, before McClellan eventually had to return to Washington, D.C., since he wasn't making adequate progress actually taking over and knocking off Richmond. And so how I believe this happened is, one, you had Allen as the experienced aeronaut with the original experience how to do it, and two, when they picked up the equipment to bring it back to Washington, D.C., you can look at the quartermaster report, and then there's a whole slew of photographic equipment on that list. And that's the first time in any of the balloon corps movement you had the photographic equipment on it. So Jim, I think it happened.
Yeah. Have you? I mean, are those pictures exist? I mean, that would be a huge find, right?
It would be a huge find. It would be. Now, of course, what happens is, they're made on plates. You can drop the plates and break them. They may be somewhere. The hope is they do exist, and we just haven't recognized that they're from balloons. But we know where they had to be taken, and we know the area that Allen's balloons were at that time on the peninsula. So it would be a tremendous find. I would dearly love to be the person to find them.
Any budding historians out there looking for a project, there you go. So let me
That's
ask you,
right.
a lot of what we're talking about is early on in the war, right? We don't see a lot of sketches or pictures of balloons at Gettysburg or with Sherman's march through the South. This program doesn't end with the war. It ends long before the end of the war. And that seems ridiculous to me. And I'm not sure I like the answer. So why did this end? Because it looked like it's the perfect program to have a huge advantage over the South.
Right. So the kind of military intelligence they were getting was so important in many ways that it was difficult for the generals, the Union generals, I think in particular, to really assimilate it. Okay. Now Hooker got the closest. Hooker created the Bureau of Military Intelligence, where he had a team of people that would gather up interviews from escaped slaves to deserters, to then balloon reports, and synthesize them into an overall plan, and into an overall view. It's actually the first step into centralizing the intelligence, the forerunner of the CIA. But Hooker, who lost the battle, Lee's most famous battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville, fell out of favor, and Lincoln sacked him, and then brought in Meade. Now, Meade was actually aware of the balloons. Meade was at Fredericksburg where the balloons were. He undoubtedly knew about them. But another thing that Hooker did that didn't work very well is he really wanted to take better control of the Balloon Corps itself. And so he put in charge Cyrus Comstock. And Comstock was a consummate civil servant. And so Comstock came in and looked over Lowe's books, saw that there were all kinds of problems with them. You know, it looked like Lowe was feeding the horses for all the men from the press that were coming down and wanting to stay with him and then go up in the balloons and write favorable stories. You know, Lowe loved the publicity, really loved it. And so he also, Comstock decided, okay, you're making too much money. You're making nearly $10 a day. That's a colonel's pay. So he reduced the pay of Lowe. He found out that Lowe's father was working for the Balloon Corps. So he fired Clovis Lowe. And part of that was because of nepotism. These things are basic principles of the government, managing the government in an accountable way, and Comstock wanted to make it accountable. Lowe was so upset by this, he quit. Now, once Lowe quit, there wasn't the connection of the aeronauts with the generals and the ability for the aeronauts to sell the program. And so Lowe quit. The end of Chancellorsville, the quartermaster department brought all the balloon equipment back and stuck it in the warehouse on New York Street in Washington, D.C. And then Meade came in. Now, Meade came in right at the time of Gettysburg. And so the balloons are sitting in Washington, D.C., and Meade is on his way to Gettysburg. And so there was no opportunity for Meade to call out the balloons, even if he really thought about it. And there's no indication that he thought, I got to have balloons, even though he was aware of them. So soon after Gettysburg, of course, Lincoln brings in Grant. And Grant, really wasn't into the technologies like that, if you saw the fabulous History Channel show on Grant the last couple nights, you really get the idea of his abilities to be strategic, to constantly outthink the generals on the other side. But it was really a war of attrition from then on. And so he didn't call the balloons out either.
Right.
Now, what happened after several months of these balloons sitting in storage, my view of what that looks like is, that very end scene in Indiana Jones where they're bringing in the Ark and it's sitting in there with 2,000 or 3,000 other big boxes. That's probably what it looked like. And they kept bringing in more and more military material to store. A clerk decided, oh man, these balloons are here. They look like they're rotting. And so that went up to Meigs, who was running the facilities there, and said these balloons are rotting. So Meigs said, wow, let's sell them. So in a matter of a couple of weeks, they actually went on sale in 1864 at an auction. All seven of these fabulous balloons and all the accoutrements. And so even if Grant wanted them at Petersburg,
they were sold.
Which they were sold. They were gone. He would have to have them remade. Yes. And so he had no opportunity. But when you think about it, the balloons would have been perfect at Petersburg. Between the Union line and the Confederate line, sometimes it was, a matter of 100 yards or even less. And from a balloon position, you can look down into these trenches, into the Confederate trenches, and you could see how Lee was moving men around, and you could see the weak points, and really create the strategy of breaking that and doing that a lot earlier. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and indeed, those balloons, once they were gone and they weren't going to be recreated, meant that we were going to be in the trenches for 9 months
Right.
Okay, until the attrition and the lack of supplies really hurt Lee's army, and then with a final breakthrough at Five Forks, that caused Lee to move out and lose Richmond, and then Appomattox soon after that.
So go ahead and talk about this slide, because I think this is interesting that you have this up here.
Yeah.
So,
This is actually a photo-like process of a map that could be made quite quickly. And as you can see, it's very detailed. It was done by the Topological Engineering Corps, and it's quite detailed because it's got roads, it's got positions, and a lot of the observations that were done here were from balloons, from Lowe's balloons. At one time he had 3 balloons up and running, making observations on the peninsula, and the topographical engineers would go up and then refine their maps and create these wonderful maps. Now this is a fabulous map of the area around Richmond, and could be reproduced in the field. And if you look at the next slide, Lowe was given one of these. That's kind of an interesting thing. You have Lowe actually helping make one, and then Lowe takes one up and then annotates it with where the balloons are. So you can see the 2 balloons, one at Mechanicsville and the other one at Gaines Mill Farm. So the one on the far right is the balloon at Gaines Mill Farm, and the one on the left in the upper quadrant of the frame is the balloon at Mechanicsville. And then you can see where Lowe is annotating this with where the troops were at the time. And then he says in this, July 14th, 1862, the red lines represent some of the most important earthworks seen this morning. Earthworks change as they build out more. And are located as near as possible, as is also the camps in black ink. As soon as I can get an observation from the Mechanicsville balloon, I will make additions to this map, and then that's Lowe. And so this is also this is written in Lowe's handwriting right below that insert. You can see the scribble. Lowe's handwriting's horrible. It takes a while to read it, but once you get used to it, you can ferret it out. But in any event, that kind of military intelligence was important, but not having the ability to use it by these generals was simply frightening. What happened a lot was the generals never, or rarely, let me say it this way, rarely tasked the aeronauts with a certain set of strategic observations. They say, go up in the balloon, tell me what you see. Oh my God, you go up in a balloon and you can see everything for 30 miles all around you. Okay, what do you have in mind? Is there roads that are important? Is there certain movements? Is there certain features? What is it you want? Now, once you get your maps put together, generals would have normally tasked the asset to ensure that this road was clear of Confederates, okay, or that there was no intention of the Confederates from their movement to be able to use a road or using other roads. And this forms then part of a strategic plan for which you then can leverage that knowledge in terms of moving your own troops. That's what military intelligence is all about. So the fact that they didn't realize what they should have been doing is tasking and getting the observations they needed was really one of the major shortcomings.
So leaving Shauna and Hannah on, because I know there's a bunch of questions out there from the audience that want to ask and see if people other than me have a question. So I'm going to put myself on mute, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this balloon into something different, and I don't want to make a lot of noise. So at the end.
Exciting. What a nice surprise. Well, the first question I've got for you, Jim, is have any of Lowe's balloons survived, and are they in museums or private collections?
Yeah, I would love to be able to say, here's the place to go to see one, but unfortunately they have not, okay? We know of no even piece of any of Lowe's balloons that are survived. Now, that's actually kind of bizarre, since the Confederates actually tried their hand at ballooning. You know, if the Union Army is going to do it, the Confederate Army is also going to do it. And although I didn't talk about it, there's several Confederate balloons that are very famous. And one is called the silk dress balloon. It was also used in the Peninsula Campaign. And how they would do that is the balloon was actually built by a group of men in Petersburg and brought up to Richmond, filled at the gas works, put on a flat car, you know, of a train, and then run down the peninsula and then launched from the train. It's a great idea, you know, also tethered. And Porter Alexander, a very famous member of Lee's staff, who actually was the person that Lee relied on at Gettysburg for aligning the guns and having the initial cannon bombardment before Pickett's charge. That's where he's largely known. He was the aeronaut. But that balloon was captured. You know, after several observations, Lee wanted to talk to Porter. Porter took out the gas, packed the balloon, and then took the teaser, a vehicle down the James River, which then ran aground, was captured by the Union Army. And so that balloon, the silk dress balloon, was brought to Lowe. Lowe really loved it. He cut it up in little pieces, and he gave it to people all over the place. And in particular, when he went back to Washington, D.C., he would give these pieces to congressmen, okay? And then we talk about how inferior that balloon is. Many of those pieces survive today, and you can go to Uber-Hazy here in Washington, D.C., and actually see a piece of the silk dress balloon. But it's a Confederate balloon.
That's so cool. Well, speaking of these balloons, a few people want to know, this sounds wonderful but scary. So how did they get volunteers to go up in a gas-filled, you know, balloon?
Yeah, let alone hydrogen.
Yeah,
quite bold. Lowe trained a series of detailed soldiers that were given to him. Every place he would go, he'd go to the local colonel local general and get a detail of men. And then he trained those 30 to 40 men on the proper management of the gas generators and the balloon, creating perimeters. No one smoked. You know, you stayed away from the balloons, and that seemed to work. So out of the 3,000 flights they made, there was only one accident, and even then, that accident didn't create a big fire and burn the balloon. The wind was so high one day it split one of the balloons, and the aeronaut survived. Now, how you go up is Lowe initially hired about 10 aeronauts. So these were professional balloonists that already were very familiar with operation of the balloons. And they would go up, and then they would coax and actually have volunteers. These were a variety of men, typically officers, that would go up and observe with the aeronaut. And in some cases, as I mentioned, the topographical engineers would be up and also doing sketches. So it turns out, because they were able to do it on a routine basis and be up for long periods of time, all day, and in some cases they would go up at night too, as I mentioned. There were a lot of people that would get in the balloons. It seemed to be safe, and it was.
Awesome, thank you. That's so interesting. So I have something kind of connected to that. Why weren't the balloons shot down by the Confederates? Did they not know they were spying? That's a good question.
Yeah, it is, and all I can say is the aeronauts were the most shot at people in the entire war. They were constantly fired on. There's stories of cannonballs going between the basket and the balloon. Okay, and so the problem was these weren't incendiary. You could punch a hole in the balloon with a bullet, but it didn't start a fire. And so Lowe, when he would get a set of detailed men, with an officer that managed them, what he wanted were tradesmen, typically sailmakers, typically those people that knew how to repair, these silk balloons. Okay, and so he would get men from Maine and Massachusetts. All right. Those states that are easy actually to take a set of 100 men and have 30 of them, know something about the sea and sailmaking, and so they would constantly bring down the balloons and repair them whenever they had the opportunity to repair them. They would, but they were shot at all the time.
Well, I think adding on to that, so you're up there, you're getting shot at. How do you convey your intel to your generals on the ground, right? I think I've had a couple of people ask that. You're up in a balloon. Do you have to wait till you come down? How does that work?
Sure. So several things that you would do. Not always, but sometimes Lowe would take a telegraph operator up, and so the telegraph operator would be just telegraphing down to McClellan's headquarters. All right. The other way is you would take some sort of object, typically a shell, a mini ball, wrap your note around it, and then drop it from the balloon. And one of the groundsmen would pick it up and then take it. You could also be told, lower me, and you could come down in the balloon, write a more extensive report, and then send it in, and then go right back up. Because you had a full detail of 30 men that you're controlling at your beck and call all day long. And so it was easy to raise and lower the balloon. Now, how they would do that is they would have 3 tethers on a balloon. They would then let out the slack. The balloon would go up, and it would attain an altitude that Lowe would want, and the highest they would go is 1,000 feet. And then they were tied off the trees or other mechanisms that would keep the balloon in place. So communication actually was really easy from that perspective.
Jim, didn't Porter Alexander use signal flags and other things too as well? Try to at least use that as a way to communicate from the balloon itself?
Yeah, Lowe actually proposed that. Give me an opportunity to use flags, and we don't have to. You could be anywhere out in the field and then look at the balloon and get your message, okay? But that was mixed by, Hooker in particular hated the idea, okay? A part of that was because the Signal Corps were using signal flags and the code they used with the flags was known before the war. In fact, Porter Alexander was a real well-known Signal Corps person that understood the flags, and so they really needed to change their whole sequence of flags. They eventually did that, but you could determine what the other force was doing because you could read their flags. So you wouldn't want to go up and then send a message to everybody,
Right.
So Lowe tried that, really wanted Hooker to change that and go into this so that he didn't have to constantly drop messages, but it was mixed. So the generals made stupid decisions because that would have been another easy one to do.
He could have made balloon animal dogs and had them float down with the information. Okay.
You'll have to go to the Albuquerque event to see that one. But, at the time of Chancellorsville, Lowe had 3 balloons up. And in fact, there's some anecdotal information that Lowe actually saw Jackson's movement, or at least part of it. Now he could have signaled that, because Hooker is 20 miles away from his normal headquarters, where these balloons were mostly stationed in and around the headquarters area. And so consequently, he really, just threw away that important information. And it may have cost him the battle for that, for that matter. If he had done it right, it might have worked for him.
So Jim, do you know if, were there any European armies employing balloons in the 19th century as well?
Yes, they were after the Union Civil War. Yeah. So the French did it. The French really loved the balloon idea. And right after the U.S. Civil War, they set up the same kind of things where they had hydrogen-filled balloons and sent them up and then fired at them. But they got to the point where they could explode them, and that really upset them. So that put ballooning back in the French army quite a while. But the Germans picked it up, okay, and really went at it. Now, what happened also is a lot of the European, the English and Germans and French had observers that would come over and be part of the staffs of various armies. And for the Union Army during the Peninsula Campaign, Zeppelin had a small entourage with him. Now it turns out he didn't seem interested in the balloons. It doesn't look like he had an opportunity during the Peninsula Campaign to interact with any of the aeronauts. And at the end of the Peninsula Campaign in September 1862, when the armies went into winter quarters, Zeppelin decided he was going to take his staff and tour the United States. And they ran into the Mississippi and they decided, hey, this is wonderful. Let's go follow the Mississippi and find its origin. And so they got all the way up to Minnesota and in St. Paul, and they stayed there over the night. And the next day, John Steiner, who was one of Lowe's aeronauts, was up in a balloon, and Zeppelin had an opportunity to get a ride. And Zeppelin went up in a ride by one of Lowe's aeronauts, but it wasn't during any battle and it wasn't during any of the campaigns, but it was in 1862. And while they were up in this balloon taking a free flight, apparently, Zeppelin wanted to know, how do you move this balloon through the air? And Steiner said, well, the way I perceive we could do that is we create a shape, an aerodynamic shape, okay, in sections, all right? He was really describing a Zeppelin concept, and Zeppelin got the idea, and we know that's where he got it from because soon after that, he wrote a letter to his father about this event, and that was in the family for nearly 100 years, and in the 60s, that letter was uncovered. So we know where he got the idea of the Zeppelin was from one of Lowe's aeronauts, John Steiner.
Well, Jim, I hate to do this, but we're going to do one more question because we are running out of time. Because I know we could listen to you all night, talk all things balloons. It makes my little Albuquerque heart so happy. But this is a question actually for me. On Tuesday when we talked, you had mentioned a handful of books, and I have a couple people asking what books to read, and you had one book in particular that you wanted everyone to know if they're interested that they should turn to.
Yeah. This is really the best authoritative book on Civil War balloons, and it's military ballooning during the early Civil War, and it's by Stansbury Hayden. Now, this actually is his thesis that he wrote prior to the war, and it then was turned into a book, and it's been reprinted by Smithsonian. So you could probably get this at the Air and Space Museum, or you can log on the Smithsonian website, or there's probably a bunch of places to do it. Unfortunately, the book doesn't complete the whole story of the Balloon Corps. Hayden wanted to write volume 2, but World War II got in the way. So the next best authoritative book, you'll have to wait until mine comes out.
Right.
Yep.
Can't wait.
But I have to tell you one other thing, and that is there's another, if you want to know balloon history, this is really the key book. It's called The Eagle Aloft. It's written by Tom Crouch, who just retired from the Air and Space Museum, and he was the department head of the Aeronautics Department. Fabulous person. It has several chapters on Civil War balloons, and it's the best summary of Civil War balloons around. If you want to read just a few chapters, this is a great book to do that.
Great. Well, and once Air and Space reopens to everybody, they do have some Thaddeus Lowe's binoculars, and they have some interesting stuff there as well. So, plus we do too. The Spy Museum, so
really,
everywhere.
They're really long, yeah. And the Spy Museum's got a great little exhibit about Lowe. So please go and get more background information about it.
Wonderful. Well, I want to say thank you so much, Jim, for joining us tonight. It's been a real pleasure, and your enthusiasm for this topic is contagious, I'd have to say. So thank you for sharing that, and fingers crossed for good weather on Saturday. And Vince, thank you for the balloon animal. Didn't know that was one of your talents. Learn something new every day about your colleagues. And then I also want to say thank you to our brewery, Bombs Away, and thank you to John for giving us that wonderful debrief into the brews that you make and the creative names that you have. And then also we have a number of upcoming programs. We've got trivia on Wednesdays still at 5:30 p.m. And then next Thursday at noon, we've got a curator's corner where we are focusing on World War II escape and evasion with one of our advisory board members, Phil Froome. And then next week at the same time, Thursday, for our happy hour, or should I say our unhappy hour program, we're going to be talking about the assassination of Trotsky. And that's going to be with our board member and intelligence historian, Keith Melton. So that is going to be a really fascinating talk. And finally, if you're enjoying these programs and are able, please consider contributing to our Mission Resilience campaign, just to help us continue creating these programs for all of you. And so with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. Cheers to all of you. Have a wonderful rest of your week.